this is Vicki Molta, and this is You and Your Mental Wellness. I wanted to talk today about the importance of getting help when you need help, psychological, when you're having difficulties and you feel like you're struggling. And there's so many people out there that feel that it's a sign of weakness to get help from a professional to, you know, and they just think that it's something to be ashamed of. And I know that in my own family it was that way. And I'm here just to say that it's getting professional help is a sign of strength, and that you can change with the right therapist and the right counselor. And things have got to change in the society about how people are treated by mental health professionals. And I've gotten help myself. I've had the same therapist, and I'm not embarrassed to say it. I've had the same one for 20 years, and it's kept me, on the right track. Just being able to let off steam and talk about what's going on in my life. And sometimes it's just really important to have someone to talk to that's a neutral party and that can really help you with what's going on in your life. And so today I have a guest on, Ethan Kelly, and he's a licensed clinical social worker, and he works with people with mental health issues and substance use issues. And I just wanted to ask you how you chose this career, how you decided to get into this.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, when I first started off in college, trying to determine what career did I want to pursue? And to me, I got into social work mainly first because of the type of education it provided. I had a little experience in the field prior to applying for a social work school. I was working with a mentally disabled man, just providing very basic care for him after he would get home from a day program. So I provided about 3 hours of supervision for him. And that was my first job in a helping role.
And how old were you?
I was 19 at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there, I just researched the type of education or what it would take to get a degree in that field. And as I got going, for me, I was very passionate about the type of education I was receiving, just learning about how systems work, how people worked, how the two related together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got interested in it.
Did you always feel like that you kind of wanted to help people and help people change, and like when you were younger as a child or anything like that? Or
Certainly. I think whether I was aware of it at the time, I think is probably another question.
Right.
I think that people who get involved in this field, something naturally about their personality draws them to the helping profession. Specifically for me, I do get a lot of fulfillment out of seeing someone either realize something about themselves, and that helps move them forward and change.
Mm-hmm. So you have to have a lot of hope, to be able to be in this field, because it can be very difficult, when people have setbacks or, it's, I wanted to bring up about burnout, and I feel like I'm jumping all over the place because I have a lot of things that I want to ask you, but I've heard someone say that burnout is when the therapist or the counselor is working harder than the patient, working harder than the client. And I was always taught that don't ever work harder than the client. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Because when you do that, you get so overly involved and so invested in that person. And if that person doesn't work as hard on their own recovery, it can lead to burnout.
I do. So you brought up the idea of the counselor or the therapist working harder than the client.
Right.
And that being, from thinking on that would be therapeutically not beneficial to the client, I think. If the therapist is doing more work, I think that's going to be a hindrance to the client making changes for themselves.
Right, right.
So not only you're right, would it create some burnout in the therapist feeling exhausted working with this one person, there's also minimal therapeutic benefit for the client.
Right. Do you think it would be enabling the client if a therapist did too much work?
I do in some degrees, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do. Yeah, it would be enabling. Something about burnout and self-care, I think supervision is a way to help prevent some of that burnout.
Right, right.
If you're working with a very challenging client, being able to have someone to bounce off that challenge or that frustration can help prevent the burnout.
And do you feel like you have a good team that you're working with, like your supervisor and your other coworkers? Because I think that makes a huge difference too, that you don't feel like you're working out of like a vacuum, that you're working with people, other social workers and your supervisor that are supportive. And
certainly, being able to approach other colleagues in the field and get their perception on a case, a challenging case, whatever it may be, that can be very helpful. To not feel alone when you're dealing with such complex issues,
right,
can be encouraging as the worker.
Yeah, I remember at one job that I was working at, I had a supervisor that never gave supervision, so I was kind of left on my own to do things, which didn't make me more as effective. You know, I think it's, and now where I'm working, I work at Fellowship Place, and I have a supervisor who wants to see us every single week, and she wants to hear from us, and she really seems to care about where we're coming from, and I think it's very important to have that and to have coworkers that you can bounce things off of and things like that. But so in choosing your career, why don't you just tell people a little bit about your educational and work background, and then
Sure.
what about a little bit about the connection to?
Certainly. So I received my bachelor's in social work from Southern Connecticut State University, which was a 2-year program. From there, I went into the field after receiving my bachelor's, and I worked for the Yale Child Study for about 2.5 years, almost 3 years. During that time, I had applied for a master's program at Fordham, and I did that in conjunction with working at Yale. I did a work-study program while I got my master's.
And that was the child study, right?
Correct.
And
Correct.
that would be placing children into their homes after being separated, or?
Yeah, so the particular program I had worked for was called ICAPS, and the idea behind the program was to help reintegrate children coming out of residential programs back to their families.
Well, that's good. That's great.
Yeah. And so it was an in-home service 2, maybe 3 times a week, depending on the level of need.
So now you're at the Connection.
Correct. So the Connection is a nonprofit human service agency. It's statewide. It has 3 service areas: criminal justice, behavioral health, and supporting housing and families. I work for the criminal justice service area for the Connection.
And so for that, now it has a name to it, doesn't it? Because I talked to your colleague, Greg. I think it was Greg. And what's the name of it? The name of the program that you're involved with?
The name of the program that I work for is called the Sierra Pretrial Re-Interview Center.
Right. Yeah, that's what he.
And I'm the clinical supervisor for that program.
And now, what do you do? Do you you work with people who are just getting out of prison and help acclimate them to the community and get jobs and things like that?
Yeah, one of the ideas behind our program is to reduce the amount of cost in Department of Corrections. So we take individuals, our target population are individuals incarcerated with mental illness. And so we serve as, you could say, like a springboard for them to come out of incarceration and reintegrate back in the community with clinical care and housing.
But a lot of them, I have some experience with that too. A lot of them, it's really hard for them to get jobs and things like that with their felony records, and that's a whole other area that.
Certainly. certainly have seen where criminal histories have become a barrier,
Right.
or are seen as a barrier to gain employment.
But it's great that you guys, you know, provide, you know, these services to them, and there's definitely a need for that too. And you know, I just think there's a lot of things that need to be changed, you know, just to, in terms of, because a lot of people with mental health issues, you hear about them going into prisons and on misdemeanor charges, and you know, they go in and out, and they never seem to be able to have the stability of a place in the community and starting over. And so it sounds really interesting, you know, what you do. And so the next thing, there's a couple things that I wanted to ask you about too, but I just wanted to mention that about peer specialists. If people don't know what peer specialists are, these are people who have life experiences with either mental illness or substance use issues, and they're being hired all throughout Connecticut. I don't know about other states yet, but Connecticut's a very progressive state, and they have a program called Recovery University, where they educate people in recovery all of different aspects of mental health related issues, and then they take an exam and become certified, and they're being hired all over in agencies all over Connecticut. And I have experience working as a peer support specialist, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your knowledge or what you know about peer specialists.
Yeah, so I've had some experience working with peers. It definitely is a different approach to a therapeutic relationship. So in my master's program, learning about clinical counseling, the idea of objectivity was, I think, central to building a therapeutic relationship. So the ability for a person to come into an office and open up about or self-disclose about issues they're having in a very non-judgmental environment helps to move them towards change.
Right.
Where the peer model, it's more the subjective that helps move the client towards change. So it's more relating to each other on a subjective level.
More like equals.
Correct.
Where the therapist, you know, the clinical therapist is more objective and more on a higher level.
Correct. So if you're someone who's had a formal education in counseling, the peer approach seems different. It seems strange.
Right.
But I've seen it be very, very helpful in moving people when they relate on that level, helping to move them towards some change.
Right. So with that, like you were saying, like you don't self-disclose or anything about yourself to your patients or your clients. Like when you connect with them, they don't know anything about your background or about you, pretty much. What do you think about self-disclosure?
I think there's a few different schools of thought on self-disclosure in therapy. My experience and how I've used it, and to be careful in therapy when you're using it, is that if I'm not using it to work out my own emotional issues in the session with the client. So I may identify with the client by self-disclosing that I've experienced a loss. And just identifying in a general way around it's painful, not
to get help.
Correct, not going through my own personal struggles with the loss, just more that people feel pain when there is loss.
Right.
It's more that identifying on that more just general level.
And so just, you know, we're talking about strong personal boundaries and the importance of self-care. So, so what do you like to do when you're away from work? Because I know you said that you also have a private practice and you're working with 4 or 5 different people there. And then you told me that sometimes when you're on call, people call you at 3 in the morning and wake you up, and you have to constantly be kind of, you know, prepared to deal with that. So how do you unwind and just, you know, just keep yourself healthy emotionally?
self-care very important. Also important for preventing burnout, like we were talking about
Right,
before.
right.
So certainly having a hobby of some kind that you really enjoy. I'm a huge golfer, so whenever the weather permits, certainly try to get out and golf. It's very relaxing. It certainly takes my mind very, very far away from work. I think planning time off is very important, so you can structure your life a little bit around when you're going to be having a solid break from work. And certainly little things, treat yourself to a good meal.
I remember you said that when I met with you before.
Yeah.
You said you like good
Yeah,
food.
try to eat some good foods. Go get a massage. Treat yourself to something from time to time.
Right,
That's
right.
more only about meeting your own needs.
So, what kind of food do you like? What kind of restaurants do you like to go to? Do you like to cook at home, or do you like to go out?
Sometimes I definitely do like to frequent the restaurants in town, but I would say my favorite food probably Mexican tacos, burritos.
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah. Well, they have quite a few restaurants like that around New Haven, and So, but I think you're right. It's really important to reward yourself for the hard work, because it can be very demanding. And so, another thing I wanted to ask you about was the mind-body connection too, because I wanted to bring this up that very often the mind and the body are they are connected with each other, and so when you're in very stressful, pressuresome, very, very difficult situations, the body can break down too. And I know for myself, there were times in my life when things were just overwhelming, and I've had emotional situations, but I've also had times when I had encephalitis, which is swelling of the brain. This was when I was 19 years old, and I was hospitalized for a week, and they didn't know, if I was even going to live or die, and I had lost a lot of weight, and a lot of that was a result of just too much pressure. And it's really important to be able to take care of yourself, and I wasn't taking care of myself, and I got sick. I got really sick, and the same thing happened like 20 years later with pneumonia that I got. And so the body and the mind are very closely, interact with each other, and you have to take care of both, through either exercise or lessening stress, or how do you feel about that?
In the work that I do, certainly, I mean, again, I haven't collected any of my own numbers or data on it, but I would say that I certainly hear a lot more physical complaints, whether it's back pain, stomach pain, headaches, things like that, from people who are also experiencing significant depression.
I've noticed that too.
So I do think that there is a strong correlation between what a person's mental state is and their physical state. So I think, and I've also seen where people, when their depression lessens, they have less what's called somatic complaints about feeling pain.
Right.
Things like panic attacks. I mean, there's a clear example of how the mind and the body are very closely related. I've had several patients who come in and tell me that they've had intense moments of panic when just out for a leisurely dinner with their family. So to me, that is an indication that there's something else going on emotionally that they're not aware of, and now they're having a physical response to that.
So do you zone in on what may be causing the emotional pain that would cause that?
So, I mean, certainly begin to try to explore that with the person in therapy. Do you ever get to really pinpoint the exact cause? Not always. Sometimes it's unknown. Sometimes it's more about not exploring the cause, but more dealing with what's going on right now. How can I cope better with the symptoms I'm experiencing right now in the moment?
But I think it's true a lot of times with panic attacks and things. It's a lot of it is physical. And do you believe that mental illness is a physical illness too, in some ways, physical in the mind.
Well, there's certainly some genetic predisposition to things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, um, even alcoholism. Have found a genetic predisposition to alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly, I definitely think that there's certainly something organic about mental illness. There definitely can be.
Right, but there is a lot of stigma still about mental illness because a lot of people don't seem to think that it is like, in some ways, like diabetes or something that has to be controlled. You know, you take medication, you see a therapist, and just like with diabetics, they have to cut back on sugar and take insulin and all that. I still think, do you think we still have a long way to go before society begins to, I mean, because there's one thing that I wanted to bring up too, is I heard that there's a mental health parity law that they're finally beginning to include the importance of getting mental health care in insurance. And
certainly, I think we have come a long way. I think an area that mental health has increased is the courts. The courts have recognized the significance of mental illness far more now than they did, say, 20 years ago.
Right, right.
So I think society in general is paying more attention to the importance of mental health treatment, mental wellness, approaching people in a holistic way.
Right, right. Do you think that some of the I don't want to get into this too much because but with the thing that happened in Sandy Hook and everything, do you think it made people more aware of the fact that there does need to be more, it's like a crying out, that there needs to be more awareness, that just like what I've been saying, that people need to stop feeling that they need to think it's important to get help, that it's a sign of looking into yourself and thinking things aren't right, you know, I'm not feeling right, and it's okay to get help. And
certainly, I think the more we reach out to people who are experiencing mental health issues, and people experiencing, or I guess having a good experience in the system, so when they come in contact with the mental health system, that the level of service they receive, they feel respected, they feel that they have their integrity. I think a lot of times people won't come in contact with the system because they feel like they may be, like you mentioned, stigmatized.
Right, right.
So I think it is about how the system approaches people with mental illness.
And you think it's getting better?
I do. I do. I certainly do.
And then I feel like I'm bombarding you with all these
That's okay.
questions,
No,
but
that's okay.
I wanted to ask you about trauma too, because trauma plays a big part. Would you say that many of your clients and patients have trauma histories, and so how do you? Because I'm not sure sometimes about whether it's good to delve into a person's past and bring up all these trauma issues, or to use other forms of therapy, like I guess like cognitive behavioral therapy. And what's your opinion on that? Because I've tried both myself. I went, just for a minute, I went to a place called a post-traumatic stress center, and she was constantly trying to bring up all these things, and to me it wasn't that helpful, you know. But how do you feel about that?
Well, one of I think the core principles of being a social worker is you're always starting where the client is. So even in trauma work, I know that there is some theory around the client telling what I've heard it termed as a trauma narrative. So getting the client to a point where they can tell about the trauma. To me, there's some thinking around, or having to think around, getting the person to talk about it will help prevent the repression of the feeling,
Right.
which can then cause further mental health complications.
Right, right.
But how you get a person to that point is, I think, part of the work.
Right.
Pushing someone to that point, I don't know that is helpful. So from my experience working with people who have trauma, it's starting where they are.
Right, meeting them where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we're going to be ending pretty soon, and I just have one last question I wanted to ask you is about, the hopeful stories, the people. Do you have any people who are, more further along in their recovery, and what is it about them? What are some of the tools that they have that help them to stay well?
I do. I certainly, even the job that I'm working now and the program that I'm working with now, have seen cases that were successful long term. So it's been now maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and have discharged from our program, and you see them in peer roles. What I think has made the difference for them is, and you know, some what strategies or tools they've had. I think the person's level of insight into how their mental illness impacts how they function and how they really want to live.
Right, right. I think that's a big thing.
Yeah, so working with people who, again, have that intrinsic motivation to make some kind of change.
Right, right. I think that's definitely true, and insight is a big thing too. So we only have about a minute left, but I just wanted to thank you very much, Ethan, for being on the show, and I think it's, like I said, it's really important that people realize that it's not a sign of shame or weakness to get help, that you can get better with the right therapist and counselor, and this show is all about fighting stigma and getting better, living well, and it sounds like you're doing a lot to really help a lot of people, and I really appreciate your being on the show. So,
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And I want to thank Madison Cable Access Group for providing the space and the equipment for this show. They always do a great job for being there for me and for the show. I want to thank Josh Kelly for doing the cameras and production, and I want to thank Abigail, who runs the studio, and I just appreciate everybody along the way who've been there to help with my website, Katrina, Skiana, and if you would like to get onto my website, it's youandyourmentalwellness.com. And so again, thank you very much for watching today, and this goes on once a month for half an hour, and it's broadcast, I think, in 15 places around Connecticut now. So contact your cable access channel and find out what time this plays, and you can see, you can see the show. So thank you very much.